We stand firmly behind the resolution that Zacharia's thesis is indeed correct, and we define his thesis in his novel to be that a post-American world is emerging in which the United States' power will be diminished, but will still be the #1 power in the world. We have 5 points to support that Zacharia's thesis is right. Those are that we're losing our economic influence, our global influence, our industrial capacity of power, our quality of life is declining, and that our social impact is also declining. It should come to no surprise to us in this classroom that the United States is losing our global power, and especially in our economic power. I'm going to go into 3 points about our economic decrease with relation to the rest of the world. First of those is our number of IPOs. IPOs can be seen as a measure of how well a country is doing and how much of a superpower economically speaking it is, and a look into the future. This can also be stated as, when you look at the numbers, it shows what the future is going to look like, because it shows what big companies are starting to emerge. Now, for example, Dr. Craig of Harvard conducted a study over 10 years from 2000 to 2010, and he looked at 23,000 IPOs in 89 countries. This study revealed that in the past decade, the United States went from owning 29% of the IPOs to only 12. One thing that's important in this, though, is that the United States number stayed the same, but the rest of the world's number increased. So this kind of shows that the United States is losing our power, but we're staying the same, but everyone else is rising. Second point that I'll go into before I hand it off to my partner is that the United States economic activity is decreasing with relation to the rest of the world. According to the World Bank, which is studied, in 2001 the United States was responsible for 31.8% of the world's economic activity. Now that number is 21.6%. Although throughout this time we grew 2.6%. All the BRIC countries in Fareed Zakaria's book, for example, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, all grew. Now I'll hand it off to my partner to talk about the GDP growth.
With regards to GDP growth, we see a steady pace where the U.S. relative power stays the same, but its power compared to other countries in the world, the G20 countries, especially the BRIC countries that Fareed Zakaria talks about, its relative power is declining. While the other GDPs are rising, our GDP is staying stagnant as a percentile in the world's GDP. We'll give you, it's just not just the GDP itself. Our economic power and influence has also been declining relatively to the other countries of the world, especially the BRIC countries. We see that China is now rising. Before it, we used to be a more major power, but in the next decade or so, we're going to see that the U.S. the power will be declining, while the others will be able to rise and catch up to us. I'll pass it over to Aaron.
The United States is being surpassed in industrial capacity and power. Relative to the industrial capacity of other nations, specifically BRIC countries, United States industry is declining. A large part of the U.S. economy depended on industry, but now it's not as large of a component as it was. The United States is outsourcing jobs because it's more inexpensive in countries like China. In 2011, 2.25 million jobs were outsourced. In conjunction with this, the workforce in China is increasing as the middle class is developing in China. China has experienced a rapid population growth in the recent past, and it's important and the United States market is taking advantage of this rapid growth in population in China. And
the quality of life of other countries is becoming better than that of the U.S. The U.S. hasn't gotten worse or better in reality, but in comparison to the other countries, its status of quality of life has declined. They went from being #1 in 1988 to #16 in 2013.
Our global influence is declining because as cultures and cultural industry in other parts of the world would get influence from the United States, and then they would rise up, and as we slowly decline.
Time. Okay, so
Stand up, please.
okay, so the American power is not declining relative to other countries. Through military, technological advances, higher education, and overall large GDP, America is a superpower that doesn't. Okay, so we'll talk about first our higher education. So compared to most of the world, a lot of countries visit America for its high education. America's education promotes creativity and individuality, whereas opposed to other countries, it's very stagnant and simply mathematics or something like that. Although a lot of countries are producing more engineers than us, our engineers produced in America are much more open to ideas and more creative with their ideas. So although maybe we have less, but we have more innovation in many different areas. Yeah. Someone else can tell. GDP. Go.
Alright, so looking at the GDP numbers, so America doesn't have as large of a advantage over the BRIC countries when you look at overall GDP. But the large difference comes when you look at GDP per capita. So the USA ranks first in overall GDP, while China ranks second, Brazil sixth, and India ninth. But when looking at GDP per capita, the USA ranks 14th, Brazil ranks 54th, China ranks 90th, and India ranks 139th, which is due to the large poverty rates in those BRIC countries, which is going to hold them back from becoming superpowers in the world.
Now, a lot of times people talk about the debt that is in the United States, and however, the United States does have a lot of debt. It is not as much comparison to the amount of GDP they have. For example, during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, it did create a massive amount of debt, $125 billion, but that represented less than 1% of their GDP, so of the United States GDP, so it was not as much as others might say.
So another thing that America is better at than other countries is their military dominance. Obviously they have a lot of nuclear powers and everything, and they're one of the strongest in the world with their fighting techniques and everything, because we put so much money into that. If America had actually just taken out some of the military money that's like in military right now and switched it to another thing, then we could change all the poverty rates and stuff. But it's kind of like what's more important for us.
So, although the growth rate is growing in the BRIC countries, it's not stable because there are so many people immigrating to the U.S. In a study, it showed that in 2012, 40 million people immigrated here, and they don't immigrate to Brazil or Russia or China. And also, those countries have problems with their growth rate because 20% of their population commits suicide, so we are getting more people.
So we lead the world in technological fields that require out-of-the-box thinking, like, for example, the iPhone design, Amazon, and even stuff like DreamWorks Animation. And we also have great nanotechnology, which is going to become the technology of the future. And we have the freedom to be more creative and develop more out-of-the-box thinking, which puts us ahead in the technological fields.
And going off the technological innovation of this country, like you said, the BRIC countries are increasing their workforce, but they are adding on low-paying manufacturing jobs, while the U.S. is increasing its high technical jobs, meaning R&D work and innovation, as well as research and development for different products. The design, the engineering aspects are done in the U.S., while the low-paying manufacturing jobs are the ones that are being outsourced. And that increases the amount of money that the U.S. has, because those R&D jobs pay more than the actual manufacturing, and that way we sort of filter, the U.S. is filtering out its economy from low-paying manufacturing jobs and now switching to a more technical economy, which focuses on information technology such as large tech superpowers like Facebook, Google, and Amazon, things like that, based in the U.S., but manufacturing jobs are being outsourced.
15 seconds. 10 seconds, something.
And not only to add on to the whole innovation, the United States is also one of the main people who are searching for clean energy resources, as other countries like China still rely on coal, which is dirtying up their atmosphere, the United States looks for more.
No matter who, everybody can time for this section. Go ahead.
Alright, so one quick question that I'd like to ask is, how are we gonna pay off our debt? We currently owe 101% of our GDP, and over 50% of that is owned to the BRIC countries. China in particular, I believe, is about 33% they own. We owe about $5 trillion to them. How do you propose we're gonna pay that back in the future?
So, in response to that, the U.S. is actually ranked 34th as the amount of debt per GDP and population on a list of total debts for other countries. For example, the UK actually owes more debt than us per GDP capita.
Do you have $16 trillion to pay it off though?
Well, the United States, although a lot of people do not think that we have a lot of money, but the United States is on the higher end of receiving money from countries like China, however, because they are manufacturing goods for us, but we are on the end that receives the money. Like for the iPhone might not be manufactured in the United States. We are on the receiving end of how much money we get for that. So, and like Maeve said, since we have so much military money, we could always transfer some of that funding since we have so much to paying off our debts.
Do you think conflict within the U.S. Do you think conflict within the U.S. government is going to prohibit kind of the rationalization of the fundings for military, where they're putting the funds that are currently being used for the military into fundings for industries like technology? Does that make sense? Do you think that they're going to work out a system where they can put money where I'm not making sense. Do you think that in government people will come to terms with one another, stop fighting over where to put the money?
I mean, we can hope for that. There's no really way we can, predict the future and say yes, they are. But when the country kind of depends on it, if it really does depend on it, and we really do need to pay off this debt and taking money out of military power or other places to switch it, I'm thinking eventually something's going to click in their heads and say, okay, we need to do something. So maybe it doesn't happen right away, but when it hits that, there might be like a breaking point where everybody's just got to realize we got to stop fighting, we got to do something.
In terms of education, the TIMSS test shows that America was in the middle of the pack in 2007, and rates of education improvements have increased dramatically in Brazil, Hong Kong, but the USA has only increased by 1.5%. How do you suppose that this is going to affect the future if other countries' education is improving much more rapidly than we are, and we're among the middle of the pack because we have problems with accessibility to good education?
Well, one major thing with the countries that Colleen was talking about is that those countries are only focusing on how to take standardized tests and things like that. The United States is learning how to think, which in turn makes people more creative and allows people to maybe come up with problem-solving ideas in the future. So it's not necessarily that America isn't as smart as the other countries, but that the other countries are just learning test taking, where we're learning to think and be creative and problem-solving.
Also, the United States is one of the still has the best higher education system with their top universities. So people continue to immigrate to the United States due to their high education.
Americans do have higher education and do provide more creativity, but that doesn't mean like other countries don't have more innovations. Like China has now has bullet trains and hybrid rice. And how can you be sure that U.S. can always be the first in technology innovation?
Well, for the United States, the biotech revenues that we have are approaching $5 billion, which is 76% of global revenues for biotechnology that the United States is focusing on. The United States focuses on a high amount and percentage of their technology and of money into technology. And however, other countries may be putting out very advanced things. The United States still focuses a high amount of their money and skills and workers to produce new innovations.
The all being manufactured here in the U.S., we are exporting them out to China mostly. I just want to give you some statistics here. There are $129 billion in 2012. Was spent on imports. That's a 539% increase from 2000. And $411 billion were spent on exports. That's up 299% from 2000 in the past decade or so. Now, we obviously have this strong connection with China. We can't break apart because if we do, both of our economies will probably fail. How do you propose that we do break this connection with them without completely destroying our economy? There's no way that we won't be declining. If we bring those jobs back here, and then let's say we won't have as much trade circulating and being able to actually create revenue to pay off our debt to them.
Since you're talking about how a lot of the workers are going to China, however, that is an important factor, but you also should remember that the average number of working age in China is lowering drastically, which means there are the number of Chinese people who are 65 and over is growing up to 65%, which means that their working age is slowly collapsing, and so that would allow us to have more chance to bring our workers back to the United States. Since their fertility rate is going down so quickly, they're not going to be able to have as much workers as they always seem to have.
With regards to China yet again, we have a massive trade deficit with China. They give more money, we give more money to them than they send back with regards to the iPods and what you said, but also with regards to the fertility rate and how they'll have less workers. Companies in America don't necessarily care about how old the people working in their factories are. They care about how cheap it is, and given that China has over 1 billion people, there's still going to be over 200 million factory workers who are going to work at least a fifth the price of Americans. How do you suppose that we're going to be able to compete with them manufacturing, even if they have less workers?
What could I say to that?
Sure.
All right, so, okay, just as to what Mitch said, we do have this massive trade deficit, and without the revenue that we get by buying the products there cheaper and selling them here at a more expensive price, we would not be able to have the revenue to actually pay off even the interest to our debt, which we are currently doing. How do you propose that we're even going to be able to pay off our debt if we break that trade route?
Time.
In China, as Matea said, the number of people over the age of 65 will increase by 65% by 2020. How are the working age people going to support this growing elderly population?
In China, they don't have a mandatory retirement age, and given that the workers don't have to have necessarily the best conditions. For example, if you go to a Chinese factory, side rails are optional. So you have to remember that they're still going to be working at even an older age in the same factories. Plus, also, with regards to the one-child policy, this is in the most part actually going to help them, given that they have so many people to feed. By cutting down their population with the one-child policy, they'll be able to have more money to, for food, given that it's really hard to feed 1.5 billion people. It's actually helping them.
Well, one of the things with what Mitch said is that there's no retirement age, but obviously with all life, the people will eventually die. What are you going to do when you don't have the amount of population that you have and your work shortage, your workers are on a shortage?
Well, in China, the middle class is currently developing, and in the foreseeable future, that's not going to be an issue, as the U.S. is currently outsourcing a lot of jobs, and there's not going to be an influx of labor shortages in China.
However, in a lot of these new developing countries like Brazil, China, and such that we are talking about, their suicide rate is above like 20%. And especially in China, since you have a one-child policy and your fertility rates is going down so much, the majority of people committing suicide in China are women. So that will also affect the fertility rate. So how do you think that's going to impact your economy, and how do you think China is going to rise in the near future? Well, most people commit suicide because they have a really stressful life, and now when the population decline and people live in a more relaxing life, and they will not suicide more.
Also, where are you getting the statistic that 20% of people are committing suicide every year?
Yeah, it's 20% or more in a lot of these countries. So like the United States is 12%.
So 1 in every 5 people is committing suicide every year.
Yeah.
So I think that's a little high.
Considering
Because
the
if that
birth
was in
rates.
China, that would be
It's like
over
good
2. That'd be the
1.5
population of
every
America
year.
killing themselves every year.
Considering the birth rate, that seems pretty unlikely to even continue for their population to continue to grow like that.
I'm pretty sure that'd be on NBC.
That's the average. In 2011, 22.2%.
Okay. I'm gonna ask a question. Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. Okay, so in the United States, we use a lot of nuclear power, which, believe it or not, is a lot cleaner than coal. In developing countries such as India and China, they're using coal as their main primary source of energy, and that has an extremely devastating effect on the not economy, like the ecosystem. It's very bad for people. Like after a while, that's not going to be a very sustainable source of energy. So how are they going to be able to switch to more sustainable sources of energy, such as air power and nuclear power?
Well, there are certainly like sites like wind power sites in China now, and when a country develop, they have to go through all these problems, and so does all other developed countries. They all went through this series of problems, and they're actually now like in the developing countries, they're actually paying more attention to those problems. So they're actually developing more new energy resources. So it's becoming more clear.
So with like pollution, well, with a larger population comes pollution. So a problem in China is the air pollution. So if people want a better life, they'll come to the U.S. because we have so many immigrants. So how do you suppose that those countries are going to fix the way of life for the people so that they maintain the population over there? Does that make sense?
Given that in the U.S., by comparison to the globe, we're not necessarily the greenest country in the world. Although you're right, China, India, they have a lot more pollution. But those governments also have surpluses rather than a deficit, so they can use this money, and they are, like my partner said, in the future, they're investing a lot more in solar, wind, and alternate forms of energy. And also with regards to coal, China isn't the only place that's running out of resources. We're also running out of them. And we're also trying to cut back currently on nuclear power after the whole Japan nuclear power plant exploded. So we also face the exact same problem.
If we do face like the same problems as these countries, then why do you think that the U.S. will fall if the other countries are facing the same exact problems that aren't allowing them to rise?
Well, the United States isn't necessarily falling, but these other countries, as they develop, they're gaining more power and momentum essentially. So the United States isn't declining, it's slowly increasing, but compared to the other countries, it's a lot less of an increase.
Yeah, as Mitch said, those countries, China, the BRIC countries, they have surpluses, not deficits. So they actually have the money to better their procedures in creating, in their industries. But we have a deficit. So basically, we can stay at this pace. We're not going to be declining. We're not saying that we're declining. Right now, we're saying that we're staying stagnant, but our relative power to those other countries will be declining because they will be able to rise.
And also, part of this problem is we have the United States is a country that is influencing the rest of the world globally. So other countries look towards us for different techniques and different technologies. So we're not gonna decline, but other countries are slowly gonna rise as they adopt some of our ideas.
Well, however, the United States, although it's slowly declining slightly, the United States still has a really strong political influence on other countries, such as in the Spain-Morocco conflict. So how do you think that that's going to affect? How do you think other countries are going to be able to have as much as a high political influence as America does with global conflicts and stuff? That makes sense.
How we're going to have political
Like
power.
how other countries are going to be able to rise to the amount of political power that the United States has.
I don't think they will be. I think that it's just our power is slowly declining as our power rises. But although we are remaining the same, we probably will still remain the superpower. They're not going to be the number one that everyone will look towards. It's just our power is declining.
So you think that they'll still have strong political power within the global community?
Well, yeah, that's essentially our argument, that the United States is remaining stagnant and not gaining any more political influence than it already has, and other countries are rising politically.
We're still going to be number one, but our share will be less.
Yeah.
Right, we'll have to share our power instead of being the only superpower out there. Other people, other countries will also have the status we have.
Oh, yeah, from as we've seen during the Cold War, our political power is slowly declining, but staying relatively stagnant. As Susan said, we're not going to be able to solely provide money for the use in political affairs. During the Cold Wars, we had to ask Germany for money to help pay for the war. And just by that example, you can see that it's going to continue like that in the future, while other countries who do have surpluses will be able to provide full political support to any country they decide.
Also,
And like what Vivi said, you taught us that we had to ask for China's help in the North Korea in trying to stop their nuclear power. We had to ask for China's help because we couldn't do it by ourselves.
One of the major factors in global power is military force, and the United States has a larger military budget than the next top 10 countries combined. So how do you think these countries are going to be able to compete militarily with the United States?
if they're trying to compete with us, my guess is they probably don't want to. We don't want to go out and just kill everyone. That.
You can answer the question.
Oh, I can't. All right. But even if we do have a bigger budget than all the rest of the countries combined. Like we said, we're still going to be number one, but China recently launched their second aircraft carrier. Only 2 countries in the world have been able to build their own aircraft carriers, the United States and China. China's building up an air force. We're not the only countries that have also super strategic military weapons. For example, all of our friends in NATO, like Britain, they have access to the same exact stuff. We're allies. They also have B-2 bombers, stealth bombers. They have the same technology as us.
Continues steady growth, but other countries are catching up. So we are not seriously declining, but we are a little bit more stagnant while other countries are rising. Although U.S. GDP grew substantially in real terms during the decade, relative to the G20 countries as a group, U.S. GDP declined by 19%.
Okay. With regards to our political power, we're not saying that we're going to be in decline, but as Colleen said, we're going to stay relatively stagnant while the other countries are going to be able to rise. Our relative power will be declining. As for political power, we will no longer be able to solely provide foreign aid by ourselves. As you can see in the Korean Wars, we had to ask for China's help. In the Cold Wars, we had to ask for Germany's help. We can no longer provide for these wars by ourselves. Our political and economic power is slowly declining, but staying stagnant at this level.
So, in conclusion, we stand behind the resolution that Fareed Zakaria's thesis is indeed correct, and that we're losing our economic, global influence as well as our industrial capacities being overpassed, and our quality of life and education is lowering compared to the rest of the world.
Okay. We can just start the timer on that side.
So basically, what we were saying is that people come to the USA to make a better life. Like, people come from other countries for our education because we have better universities and we have the highest rated universities. And they come here instead of learning how to take tests, but they learn here how to do more in-depth thinking because we lead the world in like requirements that like require out of box thinking, and like the USA sets like examples for other country and they influence how other countries do things. Like Bollywood came from Hollywood, from America, and like they try and copy us, and like we set a better example for people.
We kind of agree in that. Okay, so United States is on the top, so it's very difficult for us to continuously exceed and go further and further. I mean, we had, similar to what these countries are going through, a rapid increase. The United States went through a rapid increase, and then we hit kind of like this benchmark where it's difficult to continue to grow. All these other countries are a little lower than us, not like way farther down, but they're also going through the same process in that they're hitting a boom and they're also increasing with it. So yes, relatively we may be declining, but we're still that lone superpower. They're eventually going to hit the same mark that the United States hit, and they're going to encounter similar problems to us, where we're up there already and we can keep going.
Yeah, like 20 seconds. Done?